the irony of screen transitions in videos and presentations. It's kind of like when PowerPoint first came out with like all the little transition slides. Is like
Right.
everybody like
Animations.
every slide was
Yeah, I did that.
another
How
transition.
cute this is. I did that in my undergrad. Everything, this came in here, that came in there. This
Yeah.
thing talked to you.
By letter. That's what's really.
Yeah. Start by saying this is exciting. I'm looking forward to this being something we can do at least for enjoyment, if nothing else. But, this is episode 1 of what we look forward to being, many opportunities to have an enjoyable yet critical discussion on books and collecting and how reading is rewarding. And for a lot of us, how owning books and limited editions and so forth is just an experience that is enjoyable for many of us, and putting our finger on the pulse of why, because this experience is different for everybody. We'll be able to speak for ourselves, and, I can talk about what I've heard from others, but it'll be really nice to discuss those kind of things with you. And, this being episode 1, I know that we're going to have our hiccups in terms of logistics and technical kind of things, but something that is just never going to go away is that I have a deep respect, not just for you in general, but definitely in terms of not just your appreciation or your even knowledge of books, which is profound, but frankly, the depths of which you not just read and embrace different types, but also are able to process them in a way that makes you enjoy them more than, frankly, I would, or maybe some others. But also, I really look forward to hearing from you on why that is. And the nascent form of this probably is going to lead anybody that sees this to wonder, why are they talking about books?
Why them?
Well, there's a lot to it, and everybody's got their lived experience. And I wouldn't do this with just anybody. And I definitely wouldn't do this on my own. But this really feels like a great opportunity for me to be kind of an organizing partner with some information, but also to really try and pull out of you things that I've heard you say and things that I know that you probably think that others can really relate to, even if they don't realize it yet. This is our chance to talk to each other and others about that enthusiasm. And we're going to take time to discuss, the buying, the selling, and overall world of collecting books. But we're also going to have a good time. There's no topic that's off the table. We'll have some book trivia, history of the printed word, even topics like how the digital media is affecting the collecting world or just the reading world. So for anybody that's watching or listening, take a sip of your favorite beverage, scotch, whatever, and let's open the pages to today's talk.
So yeah, you said profound. It may be profane at times, but yeah, that's
Yeah.
The knowledge of books is different on every page you turn. No pun intended, or maybe a pun intended. Who knows?
Let's be clear; they're intended by you.
Who are we, man? Where do we come from? Why are we here?
Yeah, let's hear about it, Chuck. You go into it. Tell us who you are.
I have always had started out really young with this love-hate relationship of books, right? It's like my mother loved literature, and so she instilled this love of literature in me. But I hated reading when I was like in elementary school age. I hated reading, and it was such a struggle for me. I could pull out an encyclopedia and find an article about the pyramids in Egypt, and if I thought that was interesting, then I could sit there and read that whole article. But try to get me to read something that was assigned to me in middle school, it was like no go. I guess my sister was the first to introduce me to Stephen King when I was still pretty young, probably 12, 13, and I read The Shining, which is probably a book I should have been reading when I was 12 years old, but I did, and it hooked me on reading. And then my mother threw a Jack London book in my lap, White Fang, and she said, "Here, try this." And I read it, and I ended up reading it twice. I read it through, and it's like, oh wow, I want to read that again. And then I was hooked on it. Still hated to read what was assigned to me in school, but it did birth in me this love of books that is both the physical book, this and then the stories and the words and the ideas that are written in them. I'm not a book collector in the sense of like a collector. I have a hard time letting go of books when I buy them. When I get a book, even after I've read it, it's not something I want to let go of. But I don't really think of myself as a collector in the sense of who might be in your world, but it's still something that interests me a lot. Yeah, like exactly. That's what's brought me to this point of interest. You know, I've been an educator, and through that, the love of teaching, as well as teaching reading and the written word. And so all of that kind of plays into what's kind of brought me to this point. It's like, I want to explore a different side of books. And so that's how I got here.
So I'm going to jump in and say that I appreciate you starting out by just giving us a story about how Chuck started reading. And in fact, something that is not necessarily for this podcast, but that I want to talk to you about later is the fact that you didn't like to read when you were in elementary, because that's going on with my son. And it's odd for me because I kind of have a different story on that. But, something that is true, and I think you probably know it, although you wouldn't bring it up yourself, is the definitely the depths of which you understand language and languages, and how this is my interpretation, but it really seems that your understanding of languages combined with an intellect that is not only, it can be intimidating at times, but it's not like it's the kind of thing where it's not engaging, but it creates this symbiosis of a better understanding sometimes. But what seems more important for me, often you really seem to be able to enjoy like the prose or the timbre. I'm not even sure if that's the right word, of a much larger spectrum of writing than I can. And I've never quite been able to put my finger on it because it's not the kind of thing that you just generally discuss with folks. Something that is true is, we went through a doctoral program together, and this was a challenging ordeal and something where many of us had issues simply reading the writing by one of our most incredible professors, Dr. Patrick Genley. And it never seemed to faze you. And just that in and of itself was kind of telling of a mental processing that not necessarily all of us had, but also your passion for learning is what seems to really drive it. And so it's also very authentic. And so I really, like your backstory of how you got into books and what those stories are and how they've affected things, I think are important for sharing who we are right now. But I really need to interject that anybody who has any interest in looking at this know that they're in for a treat. If you love to read, or if you simply like to hear about more than one viewpoint on how a book is impactful, or through some sort of different critical lens, critical is a word that can be misconstrued, a processing of something where, I don't know if you want to say a better understanding is created, but a closer visceral feeling is created. So, like, I don't know how you would possibly put into words kind of how we, and I say we by those of us that know you, will, or I don't know how you would put that without it sounding like really arrogant. Because I know I've been thought of as arrogant when I just find myself thinking, oh, I'm just being confident about this. Right. So, it's a complicated world, but if we're getting this going, I'm very excited about this because you're here. And, I did not realize that your first book was The Shining.
Well, I tried to read a book called Encyclopedia Brown when I was like in the 5th grade, and I got about halfway through it, and I'm like, why am I reading this? It's like, I don't care.
Yeah, I read Encyclopedia letter E.
Bad news. F was a lot better.
Boring.
By the way. Yeah. F was much better. There is something philosophical about books. And when I say books, I don't mean just literature, not just the written word. We know that, right? The written word can span many philosophies, all of these things that we can see in the written word. But there's something about the advent of the printing press and the binding of books. And books are made in a very human way, right? They're made to be held in the hands of a human being. And so there's something intimate about a book. And so I'm fascinated. Like when I look at your bookshelf, this is my bookshelf. But when I look at what collectors do, and I'm talking about real book collectors, I'm fascinated by the philosophy of that. And it's not just books, right? We like to collect all kinds of things. My dad collected swords. He loved swords, and so my mother collected kerosene lanterns. So we all have this aspect of collecting things that are part of who we are. And so when I look at what collectors do, I'm really fascinated by that. And then you introduced me to this idea of rebounding. When you first mentioned rebounding, I'm like, did somebody have a bad breakup and a bad relationship that followed it, or is this a really good basketball player that because I've never even really realized that world existed. And then when we started throwing around ideas for these projects, I'm like, that's really cool. That's really fascinating. I want to learn more about this. This is kind of about all of that, right? It's about the written word. It's about the process of holding a book, collecting a book, having a book, but also recreating that book too. And so there's a lot of different things that I think this has the potential to explore with a lot of different people, whether they're book buyers, booksellers, rebounders, whatever, that are going to really enjoy this, as well as people who just like to read, right?
I'll take a turn. I in terms of a relationship with, I don't know if I'd even say books. I'd just say stories, and that's not to say that it's not tied to a physical book, because I am somebody that, unless it's an audiobook, I'm a big audiobook person. But in terms of reading in front of me, I really like to hold that book, and I think that's part of what translates into this kind of thing as well, because I think it's very possible that a lot of reason that people collect anything is tied to something in their past, one way or another. It's very possible that there's folks that have just found this new thing and now they've got to collect all of it. But and the lamps thing you talked about, it made me think that it's fairly likely that there were lamps involved in good times, and so having more around is something that makes you feel even better. And so whenever I first started reading, and I can't say that I remember this as vividly as I'd hope, but I grew up in a small East Texas town, and single mom, and she's a great woman. She was a school counselor while we were here. She was a teacher before that. I mean, I guess it makes sense that I became a teacher as well, but I never really saw that coming. But my sister had moved out by the time I was 4, and we just didn't have much. I mean, there just wasn't much money to go around. Like I know that now my children have a whole little library of their own, but not having much, I'm certainly not wallowing in that. It's just, I think that's what the reality was that created this dynamic where, unlike when we'd go to the grocery store or anywhere else, and I would be told, no, you can't have any of this stuff that you want. We go to the library and it was, oh, you can't have more than 12 for free. And so I'd go home with the max every time, and I don't remember having books I didn't like. Now I definitely had some that I really liked and I even read repeatedly. One that always sticks out for me, and I think it's partly because it got kind of revisited recently, and whenever I tried to revisit it, reading it, it didn't scratch that metaphorical itch the same way. It was Wrinkle in Time. I just remember loving that, just being engrossed and pulled into that world as a kid. And that's what books really did for me. I reached a point, I don't know where it was, sometime maybe in college, where reading fiction sounded great, but wasn't something that I was going to be doing. And it even over time became something that's kind of physically even hard to do, to focus on, if the story doesn't grab me as well, which wasn't the case. Like I don't know what's really shifted in my mind, but it went like back then, it was whatever story it is, I'm walking down this path to the end. I'm going to see what happens. And now I got to admit, I even treat audiobooks somewhat like I see my son treat YouTube videos. If the first 10 seconds don't catch you, you move on to the next one. And maybe it's just a plethora of things available. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but that's kind of the background of me really loving stories. And obviously that has translated now into even more than that, because there's newer books where this is true, but it's definitely true of older books. The psychology that I use a lot of the times when I'm buying something or collecting something is, am I really doing this because I want to read it, or am I doing it because I want to show off that I did? That can sound kind of like a waste for a lot of people. It doesn't feel like it to me.
Right.
Like I think that everybody has things around them that represent who they are, and sometimes even who they want to be. For me, it's kind of reached a large thing now that I wouldn't point at and go, that's me.
Yeah.
But there are individual items that have struck that nerve. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so while I haven't seen like a really special edition of A Wrinkle in Time, even though I don't really want to read it again, if someone could create like the perfect presentation of that, it really spoke to me, I would want that. That's a little bit of scratching the surface of how I think collecting works for me, and probably for a lot of other people. We'll hear from other people in time. When this idea of this podcast came up, I thought, well, I'm not sure exactly how relatable this is. But after marinating on it for less than a day, I realized, wait, this is absolutely something that I really do want to be a part of, because it's the kind of thing where I don't have the biggest voice in this, but I have a fairly decent voice in terms of understanding how the collecting world works. And I know a lot of people that come from different lived experiences and have different reasons for being in this collecting world, reading world, because we have both of those. And their stories are interesting. And just like, this is why critical thought is good. This is why having differences and being able to talk about it is good. You may not always gain something out of it, but it's the only way that you're going to gain anything new.
Yeah.
You can't have an echo chamber and expect to grow. My background is a kid from East Texas that now lives near Dallas, but was a teacher and technology coordinator and technology director and instructional technology director who worked, for 12 years or 10, 12 years extra of college to do that. And now the technology that I use is Zoom, because I sell books now.
Yeah. That's an interesting trajectory too. But I want to go back to something you were talking about when you were talking about A Wrinkle in Time, how it's a book that you really enjoyed as a kid, not necessarily something you want to read now. But you're also talking about reading books. I think sometimes I've definitely read books for the purpose of expanding my knowledge in some area, or I heard this was a really good story. It came as a really good recommendation, so I'm gonna read it. But there's also been those books that is like, I read it because I felt like I was supposed to have read it. I think I should have read this by now, and I haven't read this in my life. I need to read that book. And I could see there's something of a connection there for collectors too, right? They may not want to collect that book or to acquire that book because it has any necessarily sentimental value to them, or they even like the story, but it fits their collection, right? So it completes their collection. And I can get that on a different level, right? It's like the example that I gave. So yeah, I definitely see that. And I do that all the time. And I have read books for snobbish reasons, It's like, I didn't enjoy that book, but I want to be able to tell people when they ask me, have you read that? I want to be able to say, yeah, I read that, so.
Well, you touched on something that I think we'll either talk about or expand on, but it really is kind of how you approach, and this isn't just true with books. I think this is very true with especially movies, is expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way that in which it was presented to you before you started, I think can really dramatically affect the way that you especially process it initially, but can possibly affect how your full experience can be.
Mm.
Like a movie standpoint, I guess I'll point to something like Waterworld. Everybody and their mother was, oh my gosh, this movie lost so much money. Here's the thing. First off, let's be clear. That movie did not lose money. That movie actually made quite a bit of money. It just didn't make as much money as they expected. And if you watch this movie as though this is a failure, I could see not enjoying it half as much as it probably deserves to be. I think that Waterworld is not amazing or anything, but it's very good and entertaining, and shouldn't be have its first thing that you think about it be is a failure.
Yeah.
Because it does get its story across. And so what I'll transition to in with that is with books. We're going to talk a lot about favorites and the kind of thing that is enjoyable about certain books. And I'm always interested to find out, how did you first find your way into reading this book? Because it really seems that the lists that people make when they're honest and they're not making like their movie list and their number one movie is Citizen Kane, it doesn't generally include the books that were assigned to them. And I know it's true for me. Now, Great Expectations is different. That's one that was assigned to me and is absolutely one of my favorites. I still don't include it in the list. And I think it's because I throw it into that thing of, well, I didn't come onto this on my own. And there's a certain parallel even in collecting on that too. There's something really neat about finding an edition or just being on the front lines of something that's going to be what you hope is going to be really neat, or be the kind of thing that if you could make it, this is how it would be. And for everybody, that's different. Because if I said to you, let's pick a book, and if you could do anything with it to make it the perfect presentation for your collection or your home, how would that end up? Man, you're going to get a lot of different responses. Now, that doesn't always necessarily mean that what they came out with isn't as good. In fact, there have been some times where it's even better. But more often than not, it's, wow, I wish I could have done this on my own. This is how I might have done it. And I think that conversation is part of the critical conversation of things that is not a disrespect to what is being done. It's simply expanding through our views of what could have been done to display just our opinions, just our thoughts on that. And it really can manifest itself in a way where new things can be created, because far too often in this world, there are moments where people are made to feel as though you shouldn't be doing this because you're not the one. And that's not right. I think that everybody that has a fire, has a passion, has a drive should take on any project that they think that they'll have fun with.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, when you introduce this idea of rebounding to me, the creating aspect of that, because books are about creation too, right? The author creates a story, the publisher creates the cover art and the presentation of it to go on a bookshelf, all of these things kind of speak to that in a sense. And so, no, you're 100% right. But there, just wanted to highlight that idea of this idea of creativity being such an important part of it. And I think collectors feel that too. I don't know. I like I said, I'm not really the collector, but I can see this idea. You're creating a collection of books, or you're creating, it could be the aesthetic of your bookshelf. That might be something important to you, and it's something that you should be able to do without criticism from anybody, because it's your expression, right? It's your collecting of an artifact, or it's your collection of books, or it's your vision of how a new cover could look. All those things are personal, and so I think being able to explore those, I think you're 100% right. The individual needs to be able to do that.
Yeah. So this isn't going to be a group where we tell anybody how they need to do any of this. That's the thing is everybody's got what they're comfortable with, financially or space wise. And I don't want to label anybody as a tier 1 or 10 collector, because, I think that anybody who is meeting their collecting needs, they're they're tier 10 or whatever. It's whatever makes you happy, and everybody has a life outside of this. Very rarely can someone make a living off of their collection. So, without any further ado, if you don't mind, let's move on to what we call picks on the rocks. Every time I think we'll throw out a favorite that we each have, and we'll talk about why, and maybe discuss how this book is important to us. And hey, if nothing else, maybe get the word out. A recommendation on a book is always great. I know that I appreciate them. I can't keep up with all the recommendations I get. I try, but I simply don't have enough hours in a day. But if you can relate to somebody, which not everybody can relate to me, but I think a lot of people will be able to relate to the passion that you have. And I know that if you recommend a book to me, that first thing I'll do is go, well, I hope I can actually read that. And then the next thing is, okay, well, let's see if this topic is something I can really get into. And so if you don't mind, I'll go first on this one. This was not the first book I read at all. In fact, I had to get going on this book 2 or 3 times and be convinced to give it another chance each time, because it does have kind of a slow beginning to it. I mean, it's definitely very well written, but The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss is a book that, while it did take me 2 or 3 tries to get to what I'll just go ahead and say is chapter 8, when they really start telling the story of the lead character, Kvothe. I do want to make an attempt to not give any spoilers, so bear with me as I dance around that. But it took a little bit going on that, because they're establishing that the story is going to be told. And this book is one that I am not going to try and sell on you as, hey, you're going to be jumping in on something nobody knows about. This is a pretty well-known book at this point. Lin-Manuel Miranda is involved in writing and executive producing for the show that they're making on this. And I bring him up primarily to illustrate one of the main things about this book that is what really sticks with me each time I go through it, because I've now read it over 10 times, and it's the music. I'm very much I know I've got a big book collection, but if there's anything more important than music to me, it's only my family. Like, I am a music person. I go to concerts as often as I can. I have loved music from the beginning to now, and it's included everything from Milli Vanilli to the Beatles. But with this book, just having music in a book isn't necessarily new, but the way that he obviously passionately cares about his instrument and the music in which that he creates and that he has played, that he has learned before, which is tied to his family and to his present, making music about the moment that he is in, spoke to me very loudly, and in a way which, frankly, no one else has been able to do. And it's not new to point that out, but that's really what drew me in the first time. But then there's also the reality of this character who is, I don't think I'm ruining anything by saying that he's got some magical powers, but he's also so very human. There's so many times when things don't go the way that he expected. There's so many times when he's basically just falling in love and not knowing what to do. And that, the way that the character is both completely outside the boundaries of reality, yet so relatable, is what makes The Name of the Wind my it's, I don't want to say favorite book, but it's definitely up there. And the author is slow rolling all of us with his books. I've seen videos of him with George R.R. Martin. And I think that they're basically in a stare off to see who can take the longest to get their next book out. So, because there's a second one, there's Wise Man's Fear, but the third book, we're waiting. But I'll say this: I know that Rothfuss catches a lot of grief for not having put out the next book, but something I always just wallow in is the knowledge that what he is doing and why it's taking so long is his goal of perfecting the story in a way that makes sense for him and that reads correctly. And his first two offerings within this King Killer trilogy have met that bar so well for me. I just hope that it's done before I pass away. So, you know, I'm not going to say this is my recommendations. I think that comes kind of pretty obvious with this segment. You know, I'll definitely throw Name of the Wind out there for anybody that hasn't checked it out and enjoys anything fantasy. It's not a book everyone is going to love, but it's pretty universally accepted as very good writing.
Yeah. I have not read it. So I'm taking this, actually recommended this book to me in the past, and I just haven't read it yet. It's definitely in my queue to read. So so that's good. I appreciate that. You know, you described a lot of elements of it that I didn't realize. You know, tell somebody, oh, this is a great book, you really need to read the book, and then, you know, it's hard to describe it, but I think you did a really good job of describing that, and
Thanks, Professor.
it made me about it that I didn't realize. For me, which book am I going to share first? And somebody might say, "Well, that's so boring. Why would you do that? Why would you pick that book?" But there's a lot of reasons why. But for me, it's Hemingway's A Movable Feast. By far, if you want to fit it in the genre of memoirs, it was the first memoir that I'd read, really the first thing autobiographical I ever read. And that's one of the reasons why it really impacted me so much, because I didn't expect because it is very mundane. As Hemingway writes a lot about things that are just, you know, around his world, you know, right? And so in reading it, I was like, I never realized I was so into the paranormal and Stephen King and Clive Barker and, you know, Dean R. Koontz and all that the idea of finding something that was just so ordinary, so entertaining, a shock to me when I read it. And the reason I read it is because when my wife and I were dating at the time, she had checked it out of the library and was reading it, and she was telling me about it. She's like, "Oh, I liked it," you know. And I think there's like a reference to it in the City of Angels or something.
As I ate the oysters with their strong taste of the sea and their faint metallic taste, as I drank their cold liquid from each shell and washed it down with the crisp taste of the wine, I lost the empty feeling and began to be happy. He never forgets to describe how things taste.
She was reading it, and I'm like, "Oh, I want to read that." And so it's like I took it. We actually took it to the library, checked it out again, and I brought it home and read it. And I was there. It was like, you know, I had read when I was in high school, I think, Hills Like White Elephants, and thought, yeah, it was good. I mean, it's good. I mean, it's not really like sold me on Hemingway for the rest of my life. And in my undergrad reading literature, I think I read some other pieces by Hemingway. I think some excerpts. When I got into A Movable Feast, it literally pulled me into it. It was like I was at these cafes where he was sitting, writing, and seeing what was going on around him and having his aperitif in his meal. It just really was a book that took me into it. And then it had a sentimental connection because it was a book that my fiance at the time introduced me to. And so it's just this powerful storytelling in a way that I think only Hemingway could really capture and get away with. And from that point on, I was like a Hemingway fan. It's like, you know, even books that I had never thought of reading by him, I was like, oh, I want to read that. You know, for me, it was like a doorway to another genre of literature. And then Hemingway's own style of writing, which had never really appealed to me because, you know, you read Stephen King. Stephen King is a great storyteller, but one of the things that he's so good at building suspense, he takes you off on these like these tangents, right, of the character's background or things that happened that you didn't know about that led up to this moment. And so it takes you to the edge of something and it kind of leaves you there as he tells you this whole backstory, right? So the suspense builds up, and that's all great as far as storytelling. But Hemingway was like the opposite. It was like he held you in suspense by not telling you the background. You know, it's just like, here's the tip of the iceberg, and there's the whole iceberg that's underneath the water. But Hemingway just kind of like shows you that little bit that's at the top. And A Movable Feast was something that really introduced me to that style of writing. And it's really a cool story. I mean, it's not really a story per se as a collection of memories would be a way to describe it, but it was something that really surprised me with how well it like connected with me and brought me into the setting of this. So yeah, The Movable Feast by a long shot is definitely one of my favorites, probably in my top 5 favorite books of all time.
Awesome. Yeah, Hemingway, that it reminds you talking about that just reminds me of the Costa Rica trip. And for those of y'all not aware listening, it's part of our program we went through. We did a trip to Costa Rica to, the impoverished nature in which some of those locations are. We even had projects to help fund some things there. But I remember part of our assignments were to have, there was a book that was assigned by Matt Taibbi, but we also had to have a book that we chose. And, mine was The Alchemist, which turned into being one of my favorites of all time. And I don't know what book you picked for your assignment, but while we're riding on the bus in between cities and I'm doing like a Rubik's Cube or something like that, Chuck's reading Hemingway. And for fun, and I'm not saying that Hemingway is not a for fun author. It's not like he's a research article, but it definitely it just reminds me of oh yeah, that's Chuck, and Chuck enjoys and drinks from life in a way that's from a deeper pool than I am. And I don't even remember what I think you're reading Farewell to Arms, something like that. It wasn't A Movable Feast, if I remember correctly.
It was The Sun Also Rises.
Okay. Something else while you were talking about that, we talked about backgrounds a little bit, but I think it'd be good for you to just quickly share your undergrad. You definitely had a focus in literature.
Yeah, actually started out as a literature, an English major, right? And I growing up in a town not far from where you grew up, we had a pretty significant Hispanic population, and I grew up around people who spoke Spanish, but also that were native Texans, and then also that immigrated, and I became really good friends with some of these guys who had taught me a lot of Spanish, and I developed a conversational Spanish. And so when I was doing my English major, I had this idea, oh, I'm gonna minor in Spanish. And so I went to my professor, who was the director of the Spanish program and or coordinator for the Spanish program. And I went in and sat down, and we just struck up a conversation in Spanish, And so he was like, you probably should go take the CLEP test. And so I did, and CLEP'd out of all the basics in Spanish, like beginner 1, 2, intermediate 1, 2. So he's like, oh, well, cool. You could just move right into being a junior in Spanish at the junior level. And so I did, and I ended up graduating with more credit hours in Spanish. I had one class I needed to take in English to get my major in English, and they never would offer it when I could take it. So I ended up kept taking Spanish classes, and then my instructor was like, "Why don't you just graduate with your major in Spanish and do English as a minor?" And so I did. Gabriel Garcia Marquez book will probably come up as one of these picks on the rocks in the future, because Gabo's definitely another author that I just really dig a lot. And so
explain to me how you learn to all the Greek and Latin that you know.
Oh,
Quite frankly, I don't even know how many languages you speak,
yeah.
understand.
So I'm very interested in the other piece of this is I'm very interested in language. You brought this up. I'm also very interested in religion and theology and all these aspects of life as well. And so when I was doing my undergrad, I had to take some electives, and it was in a semester that because I was working, I wasn't able to attend classes at the university. So I actually signed up and took some electives through another major university, and they were ancient Greek, and it's like I loved it, and you know this I learn ancient Greek. The text still got the textbook. Actually, no, that's a new one I bought because I was wanting to brush up on my Greek. But yeah, I took 2 semesters of ancient Greek as electives in my undergrad. New Testament Greek, Koine, but also like for philosophy and poetry, and I just really was fascinated in all that. So yeah, I had a little bit of Greek, and then that actually helped me in so many of the roots of Spanish words are Latin and Greek.
Well, it's not a dead language yet. You could say dead in terms of countries that embrace it as their primary language. But my sister, we got her, or I'm not sure how it actually finished out, but she was getting her master's degree in Latin because of the law. All the law books are written in Latin, and so the best way she felt she could interpret and understand the law at its most base ways was to understand that language.
Yeah.
So not that Latin is the language of the laws, it's just that's how that works out. And so it's not as though it's really dead in any way. In fact, and it's obviously not taught in every high school, but when I taught at Westlake High School in Austin, they were teaching 5 years of it there somehow. Like you could take Latin 5. I guess maybe they started Latin in 8th grade. I seriously would not be surprised if that was the case there. If there's any system that I've seen where you can be basically ready to graduate from college when you walk out of high school, it was there. This may not be the best transition in the world, but in terms of bringing things full circle and tying things together, I think that if we can each time share a unique situation or backstory or history of a book that's interesting to us. And initially we were going to talk about that Lord of the Flies, but if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and actually talk about this.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Right here, yeah. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This is obviously not something that people will be thinking is breaking news, as a book or a story or a movie or a presentation. But I do think that this copy, and I'll get into it a little bit, is not just interesting in terms of what's inside, but why. And what it is that this is what I consider really one of the cooler presentations of books Easton Press does. You kind of can't tell from even the video, but this is raised. It's blind stamped. So this, instead of going into the book, is actually coming out of the book, and then this name and guilt is flat. And so this on its own, pretty cool little presentation, that kind of thing. But what's really neat about this is that it's signed in here, and I have there's a book plate. It's not signed by L. Frank Baum, which that would be impossible. Yeah, probably possible based on when this was published. But interesting. But it is signed, and for a lot of y'all, you'll recognize that signature. Do you?
I recognize that signature.
Okay, whose signature is that?
Ray Bradbury.
Ray Bradbury, right? Mm-hmm. Ray Bradbury had nothing to do with this book.
Right.
Well, in many ways, this book had a lot to do with Ray Bradbury, and that's why it's signed, because he was living in California, and I don't know the exact city. I do remember that the person that had this book knew Ray Bradbury, in fact, would go over and talk to him or just get him to sign some books at his house in California. And he was selling it with, just, hey, this is a copy of Easton Press's Wonderful Wizard of Oz, signed by Ray Bradbury. And I thought, okay, I'm super interested to have things that are really kind of strange but uniquely brought together. And then I heard this story, and this is kind of the story that we all need from something like this, which is he was over there hanging out with Ray Bradbury, and he noticed that Bradbury had an entire set of the Wizard of Oz books. So he asked him about it. I was like, because I don't think that the first thing you think of, or second or third, when you think of Ray Bradbury, is something like Wizard of Oz necessarily. And that's not a good or bad thing. It's just, in terms of where his little carved out portion doesn't really strike that note. But he told him that, man, these books inspired me. This is one of the number one books that really I enjoyed as a kid. And that while, it's not the exact same kind of type of writing, it really influenced who I was as a writer as well. So that bookseller took the opportunity to get a pretty cool edition and get him to sign it. And so for me, that is an interesting story, but it's also a great history behind the curtain, a little bit of Ray Bradbury. But also, I get to hold here a book that I know that story for, and I know that Ray Bradbury even held. We'll get into a little more of why collecting can be important for people, but the fact that, like, I use Fahrenheit 451 in one of our poetics that we did in our program, and so Bradbury is obviously one of, I hate to use the word favorites, one of the authors that I certainly have a hard respect for. But the connection of that with another really amazing story that impacted his earlier life is just such a neat thing for me to own. I have a hard time even listing it for sale and even putting a value on it. And that's where unique reads and stuff will come in. Yeah. What are your thoughts about this?
I think it fits kind of with the theme of what we've been talking about today, right? It's every individual, not to sound cliche, but every individual book we read somehow becomes a part of us. It's a L. Frank Baum book signed by Ray Bradbury, and so it's this bringing together these two really cool facets of literature and the history of literature, and this idea that, I'll give you an example. Okay, the secret is, I'm a big Stephen King fan. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, so I guess it's not really a secret, but I enjoy reading Stephen King novels because, you never know what to expect, right? He can go from just awesome storytelling to suspense to bizarre, out of this world, literally out of this world stories. And so one of the things, though, that I really like about Stephen, two of my favorite books of Stephen King are Dance Macabre and On Writing, because he talks so much about the things that influenced him as a writer. And I think that captures that same kind of thing, this idea that Bradbury had this love of reading and love of Wizard of Oz as a young person, as a kid. And it's something that stayed with him for the rest of his life, which is what some books do with us. And so, yeah, I just think I do. I think I'm glad you did go ahead and share that. It's like you said, it's something that you can't even put a value on. The idea of something being priceless,
Everything's got a price.
Yeah, everything's got a price. It's not really priceless. I think that's really cool. The signature, I was just sitting here thinking about, we kind of talked about this before. What makes the signature of someone famous valuable? And the idea that they themselves held it. I'm holding something that they held, and I really like that person's work. So this is a connection that's made because of that, or whatever, and so I think that.
Oh, my idea. That's my reason.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, it is. I mean, I think different people have different reasons for that.
Absolutely.
I shared, I shared a story of getting when I was a kid, my dad taking me to see some of the Dallas Cowboys play basketball in an exhibition show with a local community college basketball team where I grew up, and getting some of their autographs and keeping that little, program that we had bought, and some of them had signed it. And I remember that, these people were larger than life to me, especially then. I was like 6, so they were extremely larger than life for me at that point. But the ones who stopped and took the time to sign that for me, this idea of getting a part of who that person is, and then having proof, like you go show your friends, like, oh, I saw Tony Dorsett, and Tony Dorsett signed my, that's that's pretty cool. But it isn't always about that face-to-face contact you have with that person. Sometimes it's more of an indirect connection with them, but still very valuable. So that's a great story.
Yeah, we'll get into signatures at some other point. Both in terms of why they can be valuable to different people, but also how they can be easy or difficult to get. And some of the varied ways in which authors have made them available. Some of them are a lot easier than people think to get, and some folks are rather difficult, and that affects the collecting community just in terms of really in terms of value, if you want to call it that. I hate to say value because I don't want to put a label that's negative on somebody who does sign everything like Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter's amazing. He's a really nice person. Politics aside, he's a nice guy, but even as a president, you will not have a problem finding his signature. So I don't want to say value, but it is very different. When you compare somebody like Jimmy Carter to somebody like J.K. Rowling on just availability
Yeah.
of signature, fakes aside. So
Where are we, man? That was the unique.
well, what I'm looking at here is we've gotten through the unique read collectible, and next we've got Spellbound, which this is kind of a wide open topic in many ways, but it really does focus a lot on the collecting part of things. I am going to focus on what many would describe as small publishers, like not Random House, Penguin, that kind of thing, but smaller houses. I've called them underground publishers, and I only that name really for me fits because most people just aren't aware of them, and a lot of these have really great presentations of books, limited versions where obviously it's going to sell out and therefore it's going to gain in value, but they'll also be signed. And this also goes as far as to some folks that are just doing some some really high end, nice rebounding of books. And for this, I don't think that we'll only talk about publishers, but I was thinking that for week 1, we would talk about a fairly new publisher that sets a pretty good tone, I think, for kind of how we talk and discuss within this segment. And so if you're comfortable with that, the reason I picked, excuse me, and I may be saying this wrong. It's spelled Lyra. So I call it Lyra's Books. It might be Lyra's Books. Not sure. And I picked it because first, you'll see the product that they put out is just really nice. But also, from what I gather, they currently aren't interested in doing any sort of Q&A or podcast like this. And I feel like in time, we're certainly going to have on people to talk to, going to have guests. And that's going to range from collectors to authors and potentially people that run small publishing places, because, they're a wealth of information for anybody who'd be watching. More enthusiastic, not just as more enthusiastic about getting one of these PC copies. Another part of the reason that I picked these is that I have pretty different opinion about these two offerings.
Like, you could tell he's thinking, how should I tell this story?
Appreciate you sharing this moment with us, even if it was at a different time.